Right. So this is work that I'm doing for my PhD on functional ecological convergence of phytosaurs and crocs. So basically, what is a phytosaur for anybody who's not come across them before? So phytosaurs were basically large reptiles from the late Triassic. So that's about 230 to 200 million years ago. And they're very common in fluvial and lacustrine environments. And that kind of already hints at their inferred kind of semi-aquatic ecology. And that abundance combined with their distribution in the late Triassic, that's obviously not a map of the late Triassic, but that's countries in which phytosaurs have been found, suggests that they're quite important members of late Triassic ecosystems. So, as you probably guessed from the title of the talk, they're very morphologically convergent to crocodilians, mostly extant crocodilians, but I'm not going to go into detail. You can see from the picture, you can see yourselves that it's pretty similar. And it really is convergence. So here we've got the dinosaurs. Everybody likes to keep an eye on the dinosaurs. And there's phytosaurs there at the base of the Pseudosuchia. They've also been reconstructed as being sister to all archosaurs. And the crocodilian morphology that we all sort of recognize only comes in down here later, sort of after phytosaurs have become extinct at the end of the late Triassic. And they're sort of separated from phytosaurs by a range of diverse morphologies that were concurrent with phytosaurs in the late Triassic. So the problem with this convergence is that many people use crocodilians, extant crocodilians, as kind of ecological models for phytosaurs. So we have this fantastic image which shows a phytosaur doing a sort of very crocodilian-like lunge attack at everybody's favorite stem birds. And these hypotheses are kind of taken for granted in a way. Nobody's really rigorously tested them before, whether phytosaurs and crocodilians are very similar in terms of their ecology. An example of sort of this kind of hypothesis is that there are three morphotypes in extant crocodilians that are mirrored and have direct analogies with phytosaurs. So here we've got the piscivorous gharial, a generalist, which is the American alligator, and a predatory or carnivorous morphotype, which is here represented by the Nile crocodile. And you can see there as well the sort of here the associated phytosaurs. So based on these hypotheses and others like them, I've come up with a few questions that I quite want to answer. First of all, I kind of want to quantify what variation is actually going on in phytosaurs, in phytosaur crania. What's going on with the group. Secondly, are they actually good analogies with modern crocodilians, or are there sort of extinct morphologies that are more similar in sort of morphological terms? And finally, are they similarly disparate? Are they good analogies in that way as well? So to test this, well, I'll be focusing on that to start with the phytosaurs. To test it, I'm using 2D geometric morphometrics right now, both in dorsal view and lateral view, and also principal component analysis just to create morphospaces based on the principal axes of their variation. And the phytosaurs that I've been using are basically any phytosaurs that I can get my hands on that are undistorted, which is kind of tricky in some places. And the way that I'm testing this is using a modified script that takes the principal component scores, which are the scores of the maximum variation the principal component analysis comes up with, and feeds that in basically to disparity analyses, which is it's a proxy for shape, basically. In terms of group separation, so testing whether the morphologies are similar or not similar, I'll be using nonparametric MANOVAs. So the phytosaur that I'll actually be using, there are four main groups of phytosaur. So there's basal Parasuchidae, there's Mysteriosuchinae, Leptosuchomorpha, and Mysteriosuchinae. And you might notice that these are grades of phytosaurs, not monophyletic clades, and there's a reason for this. The reason being that these grades are accepted in the literature. They are based on differences between the groups that are both sort of taxonomically different and morphologically different. And if I tried to use monophyletic groups, there just wouldn't be enough data in each group to do meaningful comparative analyses. So just a quick recap of geometric morphometrics if nobody's used it before. Landmarks, homologous landmarks, are plotted on each skull. For me, I'm using semi-landmarks as well, because they, when you're aligning the landmarks, are allowed to slide. They help with where you've got, for example, curves that don't have any homologous points on them. These are then aligned and are then plotted. They're covaried, basically, and plotted on a morphospace. And each configuration of landmarks makes up a point in morphospace. So onto the results. In dorsal view, phytosaurs, basically a note on how to interpret these. You have the, so you can see that there's only 1/2 of each skull that is landmark. This is still dorsal view. But basically, because some phytosaurs are incomplete, one side may be better than the other, and they are also bilaterally symmetrical, you can just landmark 1/2. Where you compare two groups, either two groups that you compare, there really isn't a difference in terms of how disparate, how much morphological variation there is between these two groups. And again, when you look at how separate the groups are, i.e. how different their morphologies are, it's sort of borderline, it's not really significant. But then when you look at the pairwise comparisons corrected for multiple comparison, there really is no significant difference between what they look like, sometimes surprisingly looking at the graphs. So in lateral view, it's largely similar, but there are two groups that are distinctly more disparate. Well, the Mysterosuchini in green there are more disparate than the Leptosupamorpha, which is interesting because we didn't see that in dorsal view. And there are just a couple of skull morphologies that demonstrate that disparity in this particular group. And in terms of group separation, we see, again, similar kind of thing. None of the groups are really separated in terms of morphology in morphospace. And again, looking at the pairwise comparisons, there's really nothing going on there. So bringing in the crocs, exactly the same methods were used for the crocodilians. But I included some outgroup taxa for context, just some basal pseudosuchians, some archosauromorphs, and a dinosauriform. So different levels of analyses. We were using a full crocodilian sample, crocodylomorph sample, and then paring it down to extant crocodilia, which is the group that phytosaurs are most commonly compared to, and then looking at longer-rostrine crocodylomorphs to see if there are better, basically, morphological analogs for phytosaurs. So which crocs are we using? We're using from Notosuchia through stem Neosuchia, Tethisuchia, Flattosuchia, and then crocodilia. So that's crown crocodilia, except there are about 3 stem groups, I think, as well. And just a note that this range of morphology that you see, each group, the amount of specimens in each group isn't relative to how big the group is, it's just relative to how many samples I have from each one. So onto the results from that. Unsurprisingly, when you compare phytosaurs to the entire sample of crocs, crocodylomorphs, they're much more disparate than phytosaurs. They're also distinctly separate from phytosaurs in terms of their morphology. It's unsurprising because basically this is an entire group that is much more ranging in terms of time and also taxonomy than phytosaurs are. So we need to pare it down to extant crocodylomorphs, so the crocodilians that phytosaurs are commonly compared to. And when we do this, we find that in terms of how disparate they are, so their range of morphologies in morphospace, there's not really any difference, no significant difference. So they are good analogies in that sense. They might be possibly filling similar ranges of ecological niches, though we can come on to that later because that's not always the case. In terms of group separation, they are, however, very different, meaning that they have different fundamental morphologies. They may share the same range of morphologies, but those morphologies are different. Now, paring it down to whether we have better analogies for phytosaurs, for example, in groups that are extinct. So again, there's no difference in disparity. So that's pretty good to know. But looking at group separation, they are again separate. In general, the groups are separate. So maybe there's not a very good analogy within crocodilia, even longer-rostrine crocs, for phytosaurs. But then there is one specimen, and it is only one data point, so it's it's not very useful at the moment, but it might bear further analysis. Stylochrosuchus, which is just here, always plots with the phytosaurs, and when you look at lateral view, you find again that they're similarly disparate, but you find that a whole range of crocodilians are basically not statistically different from phytosaurs. So Stylochrosuchus, Tethyseucha, Thalatoseucha, they're all quite similar. So what we can conclude is firstly that extant crocodilians, they're not really an ideal morphological analogy to crocodiles, but to phytosaurs. But based on the fact that we know a lot about their biology, they may still be the best to use in terms of morphology, possibly. There might be other groups that are more similar, for example, Tethyseucha, Thalatoseucha, but we need, realistically, to get more data on those, or at least I need to get more data on those, realistically, so that I can put them into the morphospace and really try and find out what's going on there. And in terms of their disparity, extant crocodilians are actually pretty good analogues in terms of their range of morphologies. So some other interesting points, again, Tethyseucha, Thalatoseucha, they're only morphological analogous in lateral view, as opposed to dorsal view. So there's a split going on in the two tests that I'm doing. So realistically, what we want to do is 3D analyses to encompass fully the variation in just one morphospace. And then, as I said before, inferring sort of function from form, it's very dodgy. So you really want to include some biomechanical analyses in this. So for future work, the first thing, I mentioned that hypothesis before. That would be very easy to test and potentially useful to test to see if the species that are mentioned in the literature as being analogous between phytosaurs and crocs, whether that is actually the case. Secondly, as I mentioned, it would be good to do some 3D analyses into phytosaur morphology and crocodilian morphology, really encompass the full variation there. And I currently have a lot of 3D photogrammetric data that will be put into such analyses. And then it would also be very useful to do biomechanical assessments of what's going on. So similar to what Andrew Cuff and Emily Rayfield did a while ago on Spinosaurid rostra in comparison to crocodilians, they tested bending and torsion to see whether there was any difference along various points of the snout. And that would be interesting to do to see basically whether we can co-vary the biomechanical proxies onto the more morphological proxies to see if there's a correlation there. It's particularly interesting because phytosaurs, as you can see from this, they're quite, even when you have a robust morphology in lateral view, in dorsal view, they always have a slender rostrum. And that's not the case when you look at crocodilians. The more robust crocodilians are always more robust in dorsal form as well. So with that, there are a lot of people that are very nice and very helpful. And thank you very much for listening.